Want to bring in now our political analyst, former Mayor Lori Lightfoot, into the conversation. Chris Ty with us as well. Mayor, you're here to talk about this presentation you made last night in Dalton. We'll get to that in a minute, but let's start with this federal funding freeze and your take on this. Now, supporters of the president will say this is exactly what they wanted, essentially an examination of federal funding, and I don't think anyone's probably surprised that we're seeing this. Still, what is your takeaway from what happened today?
Well, I think it's very typical of what we saw for the last time he was in office. A lot of things rolled out without really thinking or caring about the consequences. We saw a lot of that happening, for example, around COVID and about the diversion of planes to certain airports within the country. But when you ask the questions of what does this really mean, how is it going to function, under what authority, they haven't thought any of that out. But we're in day 8, I want to remind people. But these guys are like a wrecking ball in a hurricane. They're just throwing things out, creating chaos, and that chaos, I think, is part of the mission, which is to sow fear, uncertainty, make people, frankly, have to go to Washington and beg for certain services to be restored. It's not a good way to govern. It causes a lot of anxiety, uncertainty, and frankly, the things about Medicaid and other vital programs that people depend upon. Who's going to be most hurt by this? Not us, but it's going to be the people who are most vulnerable, who have needs that are being met by federal funding.
Mayor, that hurricane, that wrecking ball you're talking about, can you take us behind the closed door? I was covering you during COVID. We might at home think, oh, there's much more organization going on. The White House and City Hall are in much more coordination. What is it really like to manage with the Trump administration in place?
It's very difficult. And I'm talking to mayors still all across the country. What you find is you don't get brought in to be a partner. Your views, your input is never solicited. You're acted upon rather than being in partnership with the federal government. Night and day difference between what we're seeing and experiencing now and what happened with the Biden administration. But it's not just going to affect blue cities. It's affecting people everywhere, every demographic all across our country. Rural areas who desperately need federal resources to help their population. This is going to really significantly impact them, and a lot of those areas vote Republican. But this is what Donald Trump promised. This is what he's delivering. I didn't agree with it. I didn't vote for him. I didn't support him. But this level of chaos is totally on brand for him and the way he thinks about governance. It's about flexing of power.
Let's shift to Dalton. You made your presentation last night. What was your biggest takeaway, and what do you think led to this ultimate situation? If you had to write a headline for this, what would it be?
Look, I think this is what happens when we assume in our democracy that people are going to act in goodwill, particularly people in power. We're seeing this play out on a much larger and impactful scale at the federal level. But this is a person in the form of Mayor Henyard who believed that the city dollars were her money to spend as she pleased. And one of the big takeaways, which was most shocking as we started seeing the documentation, is the systematic way in which she closed off access from the trustees who would have performed some oversight function over the spending, over the declining revenues. She wanted to make sure nobody knew what was going on, that she was the only person that was in control, and it's led to chaos and a really desperate financial situation.
Very briefly, because we're running out of time, well, the folks in Dalton might want to know, what is next for her? This is not a criminal case, so what moves this thing forward?
Well, I think the most important thing on the minds of people in Dalton is they've got an election coming up in a month. Mayor Henyard ultimately won a second election after a runoff, but only 9.5% of the registered voters shut up the vote. I think there's a lot of remorse about that 4 years on. You saw that in the huge turnout when there was a recall effort. People need to show up and vote. If they care about their village, they need to get to the polls.
Mayor, thank you, as always, for your insight. Good to see you. Chris, thank you, too.